Hello everyone to the PeopleSoft Payroll for NA session. Today we are going to discuss different aspects of PeopleSoft Payroll for North America. Some of the highlights are Introduction to North American Payroll, the business requirements for North American Payroll, the setup and configuration related to North American Payroll. Also, we'll go through the steps and processes involved in North American Payroll. We'll also go through the core tables which are used in any payroll, like paycheck, pay calendar, and many more. Another important part is the integration of PeopleSoft payroll to other modules within PeopleSoft, like general ledger, time and labor, benefits, etc. Then in the end, we will also go through the reporting requirements which are related to NA payroll. These are some of the important payroll terms that we are going to use next, just to give you an overview. Also mentioned here are the important payroll processes. We'll go through them later in a bit more detail, and also payroll reports which will come into picture a little bit later. So let's get started. So we'll start with the introduction to NA payroll. NA payroll, or also known as North American payroll, is a PeopleSoft module which caters to the needs of the business and to the payroll department of your company. It is only applicable to the North American region, means it cannot be used for countries other than United States and Canada specifically, because it has been designed specifically for the North American region. Now talking about the business requirements for NA payroll. NA payroll is a module which calculates your gross to net earnings and also the deductions and related taxes. That is basically the requirement for having this NA payroll module. Now talking about NA payroll setups and configurations. There are some setups which have to be done and configurations which need to be done on the setup level, on the organization level, or also on the employee level. The examples are your pay calendar setup, pay group setup, pay run ID setup, earning code, deductions code, garnishments, and a lot of other setups. Now talking about the steps involved in NA payroll. The first step is creation of pay sheets. Then we have to do a calculation called pay calculation process. Then pay confirmation process. And also then printing the reports, such as direct deposit register, pay advice register, the deduction register, also printing the US direct deposit advice, and many more processes. So all of these things we'll also go through later when we do a practical session. Now we are going to discuss different setups in PeopleSoft Payroll for North America. The first setup that we are going to discuss is Pay Group Table. As you see here, the navigation for this will be in PeopleSoft main menu, Setup HCM, Product Related, Payroll for North America, Payroll Processing Controls, Pay Group Table. Each company has its own different pay groups through which it divides its employees. On the pay group table, you will see there are different fields. For example, the description of that pay group, also the frequency, how the employees will be paid on that pay group, the PI configuration ID, the effective date. This is very important concept in PeopleSoft, effective date, and also the set ID. You see the link here, pages 4 to 6. We go here and see that there is more information about it. It says salaried proration rule, percentage of annual. Also, it tells about how the pay sheet sequence would be used. First by department, then employee type, and then employee. Work schedule, which here
N represents that day is not counted as a working day. So means this schedule says that from Monday to Friday, it's a Monday to Friday week. Automatic pay sheet update. This thing becomes important when you are making any changes to the data for an employee and how it will impact the payroll. For example, if you go to job data and change the job data or add additional rows or change the data on job data for an employee, if this checkbox is checked, then it will directly update the pay sheets, which means that it will impact the payroll. If you have this unchecked, then the data change on job data will not impact your current payroll process. Pages 7 to 9. As it says, report parameters, payroll reference number, earnings breakpoint, again the effective date. Bank info. Here it tells you about any banking related information for this pay group and also time and labor related information. Now we go back to pages 1 to 3 and go to the process control. On this page, as you see, it here we set up what will happen if there are any errors related to this pay group. If we check this checkbox, that means even if there are errors, it will still continue with this pay group and the next pay groups. Also, the processing control is defined here. Here you specify whether the employees for this pay group are hourly or salaried or something else. Going to the next calculation parameters. So these are the parameters that will be useful when you run the calc process for this pay group, which will be our next process. Here the earnings program is defined. For example, in this case, retirement, the holiday schedule, and how the earnings are going to be uh, calculated. The regular hours code would be REG, overtime would be OTP, holiday schedule, regular earnings code, and benefit programs, if any, on the right side. So this is mostly about the pay group setup. Earnings. As we know, earnings are an important part of our payroll. So this is where we set up our earnings codes. You go to setup HCM, product related, payroll for North America, compensation and earnings table. So earnings table basically stores the setup data related to your earning. In this case, the earning is regular earning, which is the most common earning that we all have. The description says regular pay, and there's an effective date attached to it and a short description as well. Here you will see what is the payment type for this earnings code. It can be either hours or amount, or it can be only hours, only amount, different setups as you can see here. What is the effect on FLSA, whether or not it is eligible for a retro pay. Retro pay in generic terms is the pay when you are getting paid for an earning retroactively. Means the time has already passed, but now you are getting paid for the past time. That's called retro pay. Going to the taxes tab, we have the US only taxes. Since this setup is for US, so it lets you to check whether this earnings code will be subject to federal withholding or not. Similarly, on the earnings side, you see whether it will be added to the gross pay or not. If this is not added, then that means all the earnings that you get from this particular earnings code, it will not add up to your gross pay. Similarly, we have setups for Canada and the tax method. In this case, it's mentioned that the tax method will be specified on pay sheet. Calculation. Each earning code may have a different multiplication factor. For example, here the multiplication factor is 1. But in case you have it as 2 here, so all your earnings will be multiplied by 2. Or in some case, it could even be a negative number, which means your earnings will be actually in negative. Then you have the category for FLSA. You have other earnings and hours here. Going to the next tab, special process. This is sometimes used for adding any special accumulators, as you can see here, and it has the leave plan type also here, all the different leave plan types that we have set up. Then going to the pay limit. In pay limit, you specify the earning process type to set up the pay limit. So that is all about earnings table. Next, we'll go to the deductions setup. Okay, deductions setup. The navigation as shown here is setup HCM, product related, payroll for North America, deductions, deduction table. Here we specify all the deductions which will be deducted from the employee's paycheck. An example could be dental deductions. So if I look at the setup for that, I see that there are different deduction codes associated with this plan. Let's go for the first one. Dental Aetna DMO, which means it's an Aetna dental plan. Here's the description. It tells you what is the maximum arrears paycheck. It tells you about the tax class being used for that. Also, there's an important thing here is the effective date. As you know, in PeopleSoft, it's a very important concept of effective date. Next, going to the tax effect. Whether or not it will impact your taxes is specified here. Same thing for the Canadian taxes process. Whether partial deduction will be allowed or it requires a complete deduction. Deduction areas are allowed or not. And then the schedule. Whether the first pay period of the month will have this deduction, the second one will also have, and if there is a third pay period, even that will have it. If you uncheck the third one, that means this will be applicable for all the pay periods except when there is a third pay period in the same month. Then pay frequency and the deduction frequency are set up here. So this is briefly about deductions. Next, we are going to talk about taxes. Taxes. As you know, there are different federal as well as state tax tables which will impact our payroll. So we go to the tax table to understand the setup for taxes in PeopleSoft. For example, first we study the tax table for California. The code is CA. Here is the description of that, FICA credit, and what is the standard deduction for single, for married, and what is the allowance amount. These are some data values that are provided by IRS, and they are also updated using tax updates every year. We go to the special taxes, which shows as the special tax amount and different parameters here. Also the rates. So these rates are basically provided by IRS every year and they are updated using tax update, PeopleSoft tax updates every year, which is a different topic altogether. Additional rates as for disability, unemployment, and different employee and employer contributions. These are the setups here. So this is all about taxes. Next, we are going to do the pay run ID setup. Again, on the same navigation setup, HCM product related, payroll for North America, payroll processing controls, we go to the pay run table. Now this pay run table basically attaches a pay group to a pay run ID. We'll see as an example uh, a biweekly 010209 group 5. So this is the description of that pay run ID, and as you see below, it connects these two pay groups BL78 and BL81 to one run ID so that when we run the payroll processes, both of these pay groups should be processed for this particular pay end date. And that is briefly about pay run IDs. Next thing we are going to study now are the employee related payroll setups. For this, we need to go to main menu, payroll for North America, employee pay data USA, and under that we'll see a lot of different setups. First thing, we are going into the tax information related setup, the update employee tax data. I pick up some employee and I look at the tax information related to the employee. As you can see here, this has the information about employees W4, employees tax withholding status, employees W4 processing status, the state tax data, and local tax data, and everything. So this is briefly the tax information for an employee. It is also keyed by effective date, as you see here. Next, we are going to study additional pay. Additional pay is another setup at the employee level. So here I specify some employee and we look at this employee's pay data setup. As you see here, this person has HEP payment. So there can be different earnings code that can be set up here for the employee, as you see here, and that will add some pay to this employee's paycheck. Now this will ultimately be used when payroll is calculated for this employee. Next thing we are going to do is to study employees garnishment setups. As you may be familiar with garnishments, garnishments are a type of deductions which have been ordered by the court. So these garnishments have to be set up inside PeopleSoft, and there are all different setups related to the garnishment. And ultimately, when you run the payroll for this employee, if the garnishment is applicable to this employee, then there will be a garnishment deduction for this employee. That's it about garnishment. The next important process in payroll is creating pay sheets. So this is the first main process that we run inside payroll. For this, we go to this navigation, payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, create and load pay sheets, create pay sheets. We add a new run control ID and click add. We specify a pay run ID depending on which particular pay run ID, which particular pay group we want to run. We click the run button and it takes you to the process. So if you are familiar with PeopleSoft, you will know that this basically triggers a COBOL process, PS, PPY, BLD, which is a process that creates pay sheets. Earlier we saw how pay sheets are created by the COBOL process PS, PPY, BLD. Now we are going to see how pay sheets can be created manually. This is an example of a pay sheet. It has all the basic parameters including the employee details, the check number, check date, total gross amount, also the different earnings associated with this pay sheet. And if you look at the link here, it says additional data. It takes you to the next sub page, which tells what is the position for which this person is getting paid, and also the business unit and department and other details. If the employee is related to a contract, then the contract ID and contract sequence number are also populated here. For now, we'll just look at the different details on the different pages associated with paysheet. On one-time deductions page, we see what different deductions are set up for this particular paysheet. In this case, there is a general deduction and the amount is $348.02. On the one-time garnishment, we see if there's any garnishment involved or if there's any garnishment associated with this particular employee ID. Looks like there's none here. Then the one-time taxes. We'll see what are the different one-time taxes associated with this. As you see here, there are basically four different setups for this employee. Page balances. This tells you different balances for this particular employee for this particular pay sheet. That is all about pay sheet and creating pay sheets. After creating the pay sheets, the next process to be run is calculate payroll. Calculate payroll is the process where all the calculations related to the employee and his payroll data will be done, and as a result, a paycheck will start to be created. So we'll go to payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, produce payroll, calculate payroll. Here we'll add a new run control ID, uh, something like test, we already have it. And here we need to specify, if it's an on-cycle payroll, we need to specify the pay run ID, um, the specific pay run ID, whether it's on-cycle or off-cycle. Here we need to make sure that we are checking the preliminary calculation run. This indicates that this is a preliminary calculation. Only calculate where needed means it will not look for those rows or those pay sheet data which is already calculated. If we check the recalculate all checks, it will go through the entire pay sheets for this particular pay run ID. If we do not want to use on cycle or off cycle run, instead we want to use an off cycle run, we can specify the company, pay group, pay and date, and the particular process page and which page it has to go through up to. Then we click the run button and it takes us to the next screen where we select the process named as PSPPY run. It's a COBOL process. You click OK and the process is run. This process will create paycheck information. But since this is a preliminary calculation, so the status of that check will be calculated. We'll show in the next screen. This is an example of a check which has been calculated. The navigation, as you see here, is payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, produce payroll, review paycheck. On this page, when we specify the employee ID and other details, the pay period end date, we get to this check. However, the status of this check is calculated, which means the calc process has been run, but this check has not been confirmed. Note, this is very important, that the final status of a check when it is ready to be paid is confirmed. If it's calculated, that means it's not yet paid. In this case, the paycheck number is also not there, but the other details you can see on the earnings. You have different earnings over here. You have the taxes information here. You have the deduction information here. So means the check has been created, but the status is calculated. Next, we'll go to the confirm process. Before we confirm the data for payroll, we have to make sure that there are no errors. In order to check that, we have something called a pre-confirm audit report. For this, the navigation is payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, produce payroll, pre-confirm audit report. We add a new run control ID and we try to run the report for a particular run ID. So as you see here, the run ID is very important because wherever we are running payroll reports or processes, the run ID is very important there. Everything is tied to a single run ID. When you click run here, you'll see a SQR report process page 036, which is a pre-confirm audit pay sheet report. This is like an audit which tells you which lines of data in your payroll are incorrect. Accordingly, you along with the payroll team, the benefits team, it could be HR team or the payroll team, you need to correct the data and then you can go back and run the calc process again. You can run the calc process multiple times. Every time you run the calc process, after that you run the pre-confirm audit report to make sure that there are no errors left. Once the pre-confirm audit report is clean, Then you can go ahead and run the confirm process, which we are going to discuss next. Confirm payroll. As the name suggests, this is the process that will change the status of the check from calculated to confirmed. Here we add a new value. The navigation is payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, produce payroll, confirm payroll. Here again we specify a run ID, either on cycle or off cycle, or if we remove these parameters, then we can go to the right side and specify the particular company, pay group, pay and date, and the page information on the right side. After entering this and clicking the save button, we click the run button, and there we see a process, a PS job name PAYCONF. If you click this job name here, you'll see that there are multiple processes inside this. The first process is PSPNC PSPCNFRM, which is the pay confirm process. It's a COBOL SQL process. The second process is an application engine named TL underscore pay underscore REVRS TL PNA integration payable. Once you click OK for this process, the pay confirm process will run, and once the process is successful, you will see that the status of the check will change from calculated to confirmed. So this is an example of a paycheck which has been confirmed. As you see, the status of the check is confirmed. You have a paycheck number here. The option is advice. Advice, as you may know, in your real life, you get advice payment in your bank account. So means it's not a real check. It's an advice that is paid into your account. You have the taxes information. You also have your deductions and your net pay distribution information. All these calculations are done based on your payroll setup and your individual payroll setup, as well as the setup for the entire organization, which we did in the beginning. So this is how payroll is confirmed. After the payroll is confirmed, now we'll discuss about the processes and reports that need to be run after the payroll is confirmed. The first process is create PDF paychecks. The navigation, as you see here, is payroll for North America, payroll processing USA, produce checks, create PDF paychecks. Here you specify some new run control ID, and you specify the particular pay run ID for which you are going to run this process, and whether it's going to be on cycle or off cycle or both. You can also put a message which will be displayed on the output paycheck. This is a PS job, and it contains other jobs like a SQR, then XML publisher processes in between. And this is the process which creates the actual check, like a real paycheck. So this is one of the most important processes in PeopleSoft. Once it goes to success, then you can see your own paycheck under self-service, or the payroll department can also see your check under payroll processing USA, produce payroll, review self-service paycheck. Under this navigation, the payroll department can see your check. The next process which is important is the create PDF advice forms. So this is actually the process which creates the advice forms, or in other words, the PDF that you see on your self-service. This is a little bit similar to the other process. The difference being that the other process, the previous process that we studied, it creates the check that you need to cash through a bank, whereas this process creates the actual PDF, which is an advice for the employee. This process also consists of three different processes: the DDP003 SQR process and the two XML publisher reports processes. Once you run this, you can see your check on the self-service. So these are two important processes. And next, we'll see some other reports. There are various other reports that are run under PeopleSoft Payroll for North America. For example, the payroll register, which tells us about the payments that have been done or the amounts that have been distributed using this payroll. Another report is the deduction register report, which tells us about the deductions. Once the payroll has been run successfully, then the payroll department needs to send data to the PeopleSoft financial system, which is the general ledger system. For this, the first process that needs to be run is the pre-distribution audit report. I just give a dummy run control ID and the pay run ID, and then we click run and it runs. Okay, so this one is giving error because we have already run this process, but otherwise you'll run this process. The next process, or eventually the final process in payroll processing, is distribute actuals, which will distribute the payroll data to finance. For this process, we go to this navigation, we click add a new value, we give some run control ID, and we provide the run ID, and we specify whether the distribution has to happen using calendar days or work days, and we click the run button. Here we see the process name is PSPPFUND. It's a COBOL SQL process, and once it runs, you can actually see the data on the HCM side if your integrations are working properly. So this is basically the end of our PeopleSoft Payroll for North America session. In this session, we covered a lot of things, started from the basic setups, configurations, the employee level setups, the pay group setups, the earnings deduction setups, and various other setups. Then we have also gone through the payroll process, the different processes involved in payroll, including calc, confirm, in between reports, and then the final pay to GL process. So that's the end of this session. Thank you very much.